Hello, my name is Nigel Smart, and we're going to be talking today through a quick introduction to the CyBOK cryptographic knowledge area. So we're going to cover a number of things today. I'll give a quick introduction. We'll talk about encryption signatures. What we're going to really focus on security definitions, so what it means for things to be secure, and then we're going to look at a bunch of primitives. Symmetric key primitives, public key encryption, and public key signatures, and then we'll kind of wrap up with a bit of conclusion. This is the standard copyright. Read it at your leisure. Okay, so the aim is to give a very rapid overview of the cryptographic knowledge area. As I said, we're going to cover the basic primitives. If you actually read the CyBOK document on cryptography, what you see is that a lot more stuff is covered within there than we can cover in this short introduction today. So for example, today we're not going to talk about key agreement protocols, authentication protocols, zero-knowledge protocols, multi-party computation, fully homomorphic encryption, group signatures, etc., etc., etc. These are all covered in the CyBOK and you can read at your leisure. Here we're just going to give a brief overview of the main points with respect to the basic primitives. Okay, so the first thing we're going to talk about is really what does it mean to have an encryption, a signature, or a message authentication code. Okay, so encryption is divided into two areas. There's what's called symmetric key encryption, which you can think of like the Enigma machine from the Second World War or ancient ciphers going back to Julius Caesar. Here what you have is you have a secret key, which in all my slides, everything that is secret is going to be in red here. And then what you take is you take the secret message, it's red because you want to keep it secret, you can combine it with the secret key, and this gives you a blue ciphertext which you transmit to someone. And then to decrypt, you take the ciphertext, you take the secret key, and you get back the secret message. So here you see that the secret keys are the same and they're in red. The other way of doing encryption is what's called public key encryption, and here the encryption key is public. So here the encoding is it's in blue, so you know this is available to the public. You take the secret message, you combine it with the public key, and you get the ciphertext. Now the point of symmetric key encryption is usually to encrypt large bulk encryption. And the idea of public key encryption is to encrypt small amounts of data, small messages. So when you, for example, you would communicate with a web server, for example, with Amazon or other online shopping things, what you do is you connect to Amazon and you send your encrypted credit card details to them using a form of public key encryption. It's not quite, but you can think of it for the purposes of today like that. Okay, so we're going to use various notation, which replicates what's in the CyBOK chapter on cryptography. So we're going to have a public, in the case of public key encryption, we'll just have a public private secret key pair, which will be the blue public key and a red secret key. And for symmetric key encryption, we'll just have a single red secret key. And so the kind of informal definitions we had on this page could be mapped into mathematical definitions on this page. And so what we see is that the encryption schemes are here, public key is all blue, well that should be a red, but then it doesn't matter, and there we go here. Okay. Digital signatures are kind of the other way around. So here what you have with the digital signature scheme is that you have, you take the message, which is, we don't care about, it's keeping it secret, but we sign it with Alice's private key, and this gives us a signature. And we can then verify the signature on the message by taking the message, the signature, and Alice's public key, and getting the yes value back if it is a valid signature, and no valid value back if it's an invalid signature. So this allows us to digitally sign a document to convince someone else that it was came from us. There's a symmetric key version of that, which is called a MAC, which stands for Message Authentication Code. And here what you do is you take a message and the secret key, and this gives you a tag. Otherwise, you take the message and the tag and the secret key, and it gives you a yes or no answer again. So you can think of message authentication codes of the symmetric key equivalent of a digital signature. Okay, and again, we can encode those in mathematics formulas. What we really need to do is, these are what the functional definitions are of what it means to have an encryption scheme, what it means to have a public key signature scheme, and what it means to have an authentication code. But what we really want to define and what we really need to understand is what is the security definitions. How can we argue or reason about whether an encryption scheme is secure or not? Because it's not as obvious as you may at first think. So we're going to go through some kind of simple definitions here. So the way we define security in most of cryptography is we define it as a game between a challenger and an adversary. So the adversary has a number of things they are trying to achieve. They've got a goal to achieve. So for example, if you think of this game as chess, then you could think of the goal is to try to get the challenger's king into checkmate. The powers that the adversary can use. So for example, this is you can move your pieces around. And then you have restrictions on its operations, which, like in chess, is like, well, the pawn can't move 8 spaces forward at once. So you have restrictions. So this is just replicating the kind of operations you would have in any game. So you have a goal, powers, and restrictions. So let's kind of look at security goals for encryption to start with. So an obvious definition of security is, can you decrypt the message? And this is what's called one-way security. So this is it turns out this is actually a very weak definition of security that is used in a number of cases. The definition that that the community settled on is something called indistinguishability of encryption. So what this means is that you can learn any information about the message. And we'll talk about that in a minute, about why indistinguishability is a better security definition than one-way security. So what you find is that one-way security is what primitives actually achieve. So very simple encryption algorithms. The encryption algorithms you might read in a very basic textbook, but indistinguishability, the latter definition, is what encryption algorithms actually try to achieve in the real world. So if you're reading textbooks along with the CyBOK, what you should understand is that many textbooks take a very, very basic definitions, and therefore they don't really mirror what's in the real world. So it's a good idea to have a more advanced textbook, because there are a lot of textbooks out there that are too basic if you're trying to deploy this stuff in the real world. So I find it easier to look at things in terms of drawing pictures. I find that much easier to understand what's going on. So what I do is, we have the adversary, some black box. We don't know what it's going to do. And we have the game here for one-way security is that the challenger picks a message. The challenger then encrypts the message using the encryption algorithm and passes the message over to the adversary. So the better definition of security is what's called indistinguishability of encryptions. Here, what you have is you take an encryption function, and we are going to, which is defined by some key, and we're going to, the attacker chooses 2 messages of equal length. And what the challenger then does is encrypt one of these messages and then passes them back to the adversary, and then the adversary has to work out which message was encrypted. This might seem a little weird, but imagine you've got a system where you're encrypting, say, stock market data or stock market orders. You don't really care whether someone says, please buy 5 shares of Shell. What you really care about is the meaning of the message, whether it's buy or sell. So you don't really care what the format of the message is. You just inform about any form of information, whether it's a buy order, whether it's a sell order, whether you're buying Shell shares, whether you're buying Microsoft shares. So indistinguishability of encryptions actually captures this much more subtle notion that An attacker doesn't really care about the exact form of the message, but actually cares about information about the message. And this is the de facto definition for security. So if we look at that in terms of our pictures, what we see is we have this picture of the attacker. He comes up with two messages, M0 and M1. The adversary generates a bit B, which is either 0 or 1, and then the challenger, encrypts either message 0 or message 1, passes it back to the adversary. This ciphertext is called the target ciphertext, and then the adversary must guess which bit B dashed. That's his guess, whether his guess is the correct. So the adversary wins this game if the bit B chosen by the challenger is the same as the bit B dashed output by the adversary. And of course, we've got to remember, we must have that the two messages have the same length. So this is the symmetric key version. And if you look at the public key version, it's virtually identical, except that the adversary is given the public key. After all, it's a public key encryption scheme, so the public key is public, so he's got it. So these define what we mean by the adversarial goals for encryption. And we can also define adversarial powers. And then we combine the adversarial goal with an adversarial power to get the full game. So we've seen the goals are IND, or one way, and then the adversarial powers are generally passive attack, where the adversary has no extra power at all, which is essentially the pictures we just saw. A chosen plaintext attack, where the adversary can encrypt arbitrary messages of his choosing, or what's called a chosen ciphertext attack, where the adversary can decrypt any message of his choosing except for the one that is the target ciphertext. And we'll kind of go through these in the pictorial way to see them in more detail. So here, if we look at the in-CPA encryption case, what we see is that the adversary has access to an oracle, OE, for which he can send arbitrary messages M and get encryptions back. So this is the symmetric key case for in-CPA encryption. For in-CCA encryption, what we have is that the adversary has access to that encryption oracle, but also has access to a decryption oracle, which stops the adversary, which allows the adversary to obtain arbitrary decryptions of ciphertext, but he's obviously not allowed to target the target ciphertext, because that would be game over. That makes winning the game far too easy. In the public key case, things are slightly different. Because in a public key algorithm, you always have access to the public key encryption algorithm, there is no special oracle for the in-CPA case. So in-CPA for public key encryption is the same as passive security for public key encryption. So the only interesting thing in the public key case is the in-CCA case, where we give the adversary again an oracle which allows him to decrypt ciphertext. Now you might think that these are overblown security definitions, but it turns out that these definitions capture many real-world attacks on real-world ciphers. So for example, early versions of the SSL cipher suite, which is used to secure internet traffic, was susceptible to in-CCA attacks. So basically, you could use a web server to act as a decryption oracle. Many early versions of the IPsec protocol suite had suffered from in-CCA attack vectors which could break the ciphers. So it's really important to have these very strong security notions, because they actually protect us against bad security definitions or bad applications. So it turns out that we can do exactly the same goal for same game for defining security for message authentication codes. So here we see the picture, which looks rather complicated for message authentication code security. So here what you have is that the environment comes up with a random key K. The adversary is given access to two oracles. One oracle which allows him to generate MAC tags on messages of his choosing, and also a verify oracle that allows him to verify whether a MAC tag is correct. And then the adversary's goal is to come up with a MAC message pair, so an M star and a T star, such that the verification algorithm passes, but this is not a query that the adversary has already sent to his MAC oracle. In other words, this is a new tag pair that hasn't been seen before. So that's what we have for MAC security. And digital signature security is virtually the same. Is that what we have is that we have the public key encryption algorithm, a public key, secret key, key generation. Then the adversary generates signatures by querying a signature oracle, and then it's got to come up with another signature that hasn't been queried to the oracle. So that's the definitions. More details you can read in the CyBOK itself. Okay, so that's the security definition. So let's see how we construct these things in the real world. So the basic building block for a lot of encryption algorithms is what's called a block cipher, which takes an arbitrary block of data, a B-bit string, and maps it to another B-bit string. And this is what's called a block cipher. And the standard block cipher you will see deployed these days is what's called the Advanced Encryption Standard, AES. So AES takes a block size of 128 bits and then encrypts it using a key which is either 128 bits, 192 bits, or 256 bits. So this corresponds to when you see on websites things saying we secure this with 256-bit encryption. What they're actually saying is that they're using AES at a key length of 256 bits to define a block cipher. Now the key point is that a block cipher is not an encryption algorithm. So they're kind of lying when they say it's 256-bit encryption, because what they haven't actually told you is how they use the block cipher. And it's how you use a block cipher that's really, really, really key. So if we look at, for example, the standard way you could use a block cipher is what's called ECB mode. So what ECB mode does is it divides a big message, for example, a movie, into blocks, M1, M2, M3, M4, and turn each block cipher. Now this is a very insecure form of encryption. This is basically not encryption. You can show that if you used it with a good block cipher, this encryption algorithm is one-way pass or one-way CPA, but we've already said that one-way security is not very good at all. And it's a kind of elementary exercise to show that ECB mode is not one-way CCA in pass, in CPA, or in CCA. So in real applications, you shouldn't be using ECB mode. So this is kind of a very old mode of encryption. So in the 70s, the US government came up with a different mode of encryption, which is what's called CBC mode. So here in CBC mode, it's a randomized mode. You have a random IV, which is then XORed in with the first message block. This is passed through the encryption algorithm to give the first ciphertext block. The first ciphertext block is then XORed with the second message block passed through an encryption algorithm, and so on. Now, this is much better encryption than CBC mode and than ECB mode, because CBC mode is in CPA secure, which is at least better than what we had with ECB mode. If we only use a zero IV, which some standards do, then this only gives us what's called an end-pass encryption algorithm. But again, it's an elementary exercise to show that CBC mode is itself not one-way CCA or in CCA. So at least it's better than ECB mode, but it's not the best. So this is a mode from the 70s, and the problem here is with this mode is that you have to apply the encryption in blocks in a sequential manner, which is a little bit of which was fine in the 70s because there was less parallel processing, there was less pipelining within processors. There's a bit of a problem with modern processors. So the modern variant of CBC mode is something called counter mode. So in counter mode, what you do is you encrypt a random counter, and then you XOR the output of the block cipher with the incoming message. So you take an IV, you encrypt IV plus 1, and then you XOR the output with message 1 to give you C1. And you do this for all blocks. The advantage of this is that we can apply the block cipher in a highly parallel form, and this gives us a higher throughput. But just like CBC mode, this is better than ECB mode, but it's not a fully secure encryption scheme because we do not have it being in CCA, which is the gold standard of encryption. So the real question is how do you take a mode like CBC mode and counter mode and turn them into a fully secure in CCA encryption scheme? Now the way we do that is what we do is we combine a in CPA symmetric encryption scheme, for example CBC mode or counter mode, and then we also combine it with a MAC function to combine the two together. So the way these are done is that the key for the new scheme, the new super scheme, is both the key of the encryption scheme and the key of the MAC. So to create a in CCA encryption scheme, what we do is we take a MAC scheme and a in CPA encryption scheme. We take the key, we split it into two. The first key is used to encrypt the message, and this gives us the ciphertext C0. We then take the ciphertext C0 and pass it through the MAC function to give us the tag C1, and then the ciphertext is actually C0 C1. Now it's very important for security here that you apply the MAC function to the C0 and not to anything else, because there's a number of old standards that didn't do this and were eventually broken in the field. For decryption, what you do is you take the key, you split it again, you first decrypt the C0 component to give you M, and then you verify the MAC key is correct by macking the C0 again. You check whether the C1 component you've just got is equal to the C1 component that you got from the ciphertext. If it is, then you've got a valid encryption. If it isn't, then you return the perp symbol, which says things are invalid, that the recipient has received an invalid ciphertext. So that summarizes how we do symmetric key encryption from a very, very basic viewpoint. So we now turn to public key encryption. So the standard method for public key encryption for a very, very long time was what's called RSA, which goes back to the mid-70s. This is less used now because RSA, the key sizes have to be very big. It's based on factoring, which is not as hard a problem as it once was. We can now factor very, very large numbers quite easily. So this is kind of more for legacy reasons, but it helps explain maybe some of the other things that you might see in the real world. So RSA works by taking two large primes, P and Q, and multiplies them together. This gives us the public key modulus n. And we then take the Euler phi function, which is P minus 1 times Q minus 1. Now the Euler phi function is essentially the order of the multiplicative group modulo n. So this and that mathematical fact allows us to define an encryption scheme. So what we do to define the encryption scheme, we take a public random integer e, often called the encryption exponent, which just has to be have no factors in common with the Euler phi function. And then because it has no factors in common with the Euler phi function, we can find another value d called the private decryption exponent, which such that e times d is equal to 1 modulo phi of n. So these are the values that we keep. So the public key is n and e, and the private key is d, p, and q. Now these values allow us to produce what's called the RSA trapdoor one-way permutation. So in the forward direction, this gives us, we take the message and we raise it to the power e mod n. But if we know the trapdoor d, we have an inverse function which goes to c to the d mod n. And this allows us to invert the function. So if we know the secret decryption exponent, we can map messages. We can map messages to ciphertext, that's the forward direction, and we can take ciphertext to messages in the backward direction. And this is what's called textbook RSA, because it's something that should only ever be seen in a textbook. It allows you to encrypt messages and decrypt them with the inverse function. Okay, the other way of producing in the real world at the moment, encryption schemes and signature schemes is using what's called the discrete logarithm problem. And here what we take is we take some finite abelian group G, which is usually in the real world an elliptic curve, which has prime order Q. And the discrete logarithm problem is that you take some value n mod Q and you add p to itself n times to give you something called n times p. And the idea is that this is a one-way function. If I give you n times p and p, it's very hard for you to compute n. And this is a much more difficult problem than factoring. So this is used a lot in a number of existing schemes. Related to the discrete logarithm problem is what's called the Diffie-Hellman problem. And here you are given p, x times p, and y times p, and you're asked to produce a secret value which is xy times p. So that's what's called the computational Diffie-Hellman problem, that given the triple p, px, and py, you can't come up with pz. And then there's another problem called the decisional Diffie-Hellman problem, which is if I give you px, py, pz, where px is x times p, py is y times p, pz is z times p, then and such that z has been selected with probability 1/2 to either be uniformly random or x times y mod q, then determining which case you're in, whether z is random or z is actually equal to x times y, is also a hard computational problem. Now from these problems we can define, from these discrete log-based problems, the discrete logarithm problem and the Diffie-Hellman problem, we can define a very simple encryption scheme called L-Gamal. In L-Gamal we take a secret key x, we multiply x times p to give us q, and that gives us the public key q. To encrypt a message, which is an element in the group, we take a random ephemeral key, we compute k times q and add it to m. This gives us the C2 component. And then we add k times, and we then multiply k by p to give us the C1 component. And C1, C2 form the ciphertext. And notice how this is randomized. This is a randomized encryption algorithm. So every time you encrypt a message, you would get a different ciphertext coming out. And then to decrypt, you kind of apply the obvious equation to decrypt. Now what's nice about L-Gamal is that we can show it's secure. So textbook RSA is not in CPA secure. The reason it's not in CPA secure is because it's not randomized. If something is if you have a public key encryption algorithm and you want it to be CPA secure, then it needs to be randomized. And textbook RSA was not randomized. And as we saw on the previous slide, L-Gamal is randomized, so it's a randomized encryption algorithm. So there is a hope it is in CPA secure, and it is indeed in CPA secure. So L-Gamal can easily be shown to be one-way CPA if the CDH problem is hard, and it can be shown to be in CPA if the DDH problem is hard. But neither of them are secure in the strong sense of in CCA, and also both have restricted to very, very small message spaces. So in practice what we do is we use a hybrid cipher approach. So the hybrid cipher approach, what happens is that we divide the algorithms into what's called a KEM, a key encapsulation mechanism, and a data encapsulation mechanism. The key encapsulation mechanism is used to transport a key, and the data encapsulation mechanism is used to transport the message. And for the data encapsulation mechanism, the DEM, what we use is we use an in-CCA symmetric cipher, just like we saw earlier. And symmetric ciphers are very fast, so they allow us to encrypt very large messages. For example, they allow us to encrypt movies or web streaming traffic or whatever. So, what is a key encapsulation mechanism? Because if a DEM is just a symmetric cipher, in CCA symmetric cipher, a key encapsulation mechanism is the only thing we really have to worry about. So a key encapsulation mechanism is a bit like a public key encryption algorithm for which there's no message. What it does is a key encapsulation mechanism generates an encryption or an encapsulation of a key K, where the key K is a key for a symmetric encryption algorithm, with the decapsulation algorithm either returning the perp symbol if it's an invalid encapsulation, or it returns the encapsulation key itself. So to combine a KEM with a DEM is relatively simple. If you want to encrypt, you apply the KEM to get a key and a ciphertext. You then encrypt your message with that key to give you the ciphertext component E, and the encryption is C concatenated with E. To decrypt, you invert the chem to get a key. If the key is valid, you then can use that to decrypt the E component to give you the message, at both times checking whether you've got an invalid ciphertext or not. So this allows us to protect against CCA attacks. So if we kind of pass this and we try to, how do we then construct a chem? Well, if we take a trapdoor one-way function like RSA, and then a hash function, we can create something that's essentially what you can call as full domain hash chem. So when used with RSA, this is called RSA chem. This occurs in a number of standards. So to see how this works is what you do is you pick an element of the domain of your trapdoor one-way function X at random. You encrypt this using the trapdoor one-way function, and then you hash X to get the key for the den. And then the decapsulation algorithm is you just invert the one-way function and then hash to get the key back. So this is a very simple version of how you would use RSA to produce a chem. And you can use Diffie-Hellman to produce a chem in a similar way. And this is exactly what is done in many standards. This is what's called DHIS, or sometimes you see it called in standards ECIS. And what it does is you have a private key, public key, which is just like El-Gamal public keys. And then what you're doing is you're essentially just creating the first component of the El-Gamal ciphertext. Ends up being the encapsulation. And then to decapsulate, you essentially do half of the El-Gamal decryption and then pass it through a hash function to get the hash function to get the key for the den. And we'll move on to signature algorithms. So we'll give you some idea of how public key signature algorithms are constructed in practice. Now, the obvious way of doing signature algorithms is we use a hash function. So this is a variant of the signature scheme based on RSA. So what we do is we hash the message to get a hash value, and then we sign. What we do is we use the RSA decryption algorithm to sign. So if we see on the slide here, we've taken the hash of M, we've raised it to the power D, and that allows us to. That's essentially what we're doing, is we're decrypting the hash of the message, which is kind of weird. This is like encryption in reverse gives us the algorithm. But to verify, what we do is if we used decryption to sign, then it's kind of clear that what we use for verifying the signature is we use encryption to verify. So what we do is we encrypt the signature, which should give us the message back, and then we check that that message is actually equal to the hash of the original message. So this is what's called RSA full domain hash. It's very similar to the RSA full domain hash chem. And this is used it forms the basis of a number of standards that are used to do RSA. We can also form digital signature algorithms using a discrete log setting, and the standard way of doing this is what's called the digital signature algorithm, which was created by the US government in the late 1990s, but is now used quite a lot, especially in its elliptic curve variant, which we give here. So again, we create the public key just like we did for El-Gamal, is that there's a secret key X. We have X times P equals Q. And we assume there's some function, which doesn't really matter, which maps the group elements to the integers mod Q. So to create the signature algorithm, we run this algorithm here. The signer hashes the message to get some value E. That's the first stage. The second stage is the signer picks a random key K between 0 and Q, and then forms K times P. This K times P is converted to an integer mod Q, which we call R, and then we have that the final signature is E plus X times R divided by K mod Q. The signature on the message is the pair R and S. Now, two important points here with this the signature algorithm is that the first is this random key K really has to be very, very random. If it's chosen with any form of bias, then the signing algorithm becomes insecure. And the other point is that this the signing equation involves a division by K, which is relatively hard to do. Another point which you might want to look at is that the hash function that we apply to the message M, which is a historical accident and does mean that the DSA algorithm doesn't have as strong a security properties as we would like in a modern algorithm. Okay, so that's the signing algorithm. To verify, what we do is we hash the message again. We then compute a value A, which is the hash value divided by S mod Q, where S is the second component of the signature. And we then compute B, which is R divided by S mod Q, where R is the first component of the signature. And then we compute A times B plus B times Q. We apply it through the function F, and then we should get the same value back, R, that we originally had in the signing equation. So that's how we do digital signatures using discrete log problems. Okay. So we're going to wrap up with a conclusion and give you some background of some of the other things you can do, and which are described in the CyBOK in more detail. So what we've done here is just cover the really basic notions of cryptography. If you look in the CyBOK document, you'll see a similar discussion and a similar introduction to a number of other aspects in cryptography. Cryptography is much broader and can give much broader applications and support to cybersecurity. So, for example, we haven't really talked about key agreement protocols, which are used in your browser to connect to websites. These turn out to be a lot more tricky than encryption or signatures. They're not just a simple application of encryption or signatures. They're much more involved analysis of key agreement protocols. We haven't talked about authentication protocols, which allow one entity to authenticate themselves to another entity. These are used, for example, maybe authentication protocols to get into your car if you have an electronic key fob, or if you're getting into a building, or you're authenticating yourself in an underground situation if you're trying to go through the London Underground. Another thing we haven't talked about is zero-knowledge protocols. So zero-knowledge protocols are actually used in a number of applications. They're used in chip and pin cards to convince someone that you actually have a valid chip and pin card. So here what you do is you engage in a protocol to prove that you know something without revealing anything about the thing you know. So you can think of zero-knowledge protocols as more secure, more complex versions of password protocols. Zero-knowledge protocols have recently found applications in the zero cache blockchain cryptocurrency, where you're trying to hide which transactions are related to each other. We haven't talked about multi-party computation, which allows one to compute any function securely. So suppose you are a company and you have one database and you want to share that database with another company so you could compute some combined results of the data. I think you could be trying to compute valid statistical information on your employees' pay and how much they're paid to the other company. Multi-party computation allows you to compute any function on secure data by joining databases together in such a way. It was recently found a number of applications. We haven't talked about blockchain applications, which are also mentioned in the CyBOK. You can't have done anything on the internet these days without hearing of blockchain or Bitcoin, and so we also discussed that within the CyBOK. We haven't talked about private information retrieval, which is a bit like multi-party computation, but allows you to recover data from a database without the database holder learning what data you've retrieved and what other data is in the database. So it allows you to store data remotely and then recover it without the database owner learning what you've recovered. We haven't talked about the huge amounts of implementation aspects. Here we've just been talking about the security of encryption schemes and signature schemes, but actually, they're just the mathematical definitions of security. You also have to worry about implementation security. So in the CyBOK, we discuss information security. We haven't talked about fully homomorphic encryption, which is a technique that allows you to outsource data to the cloud and allow the cloud to compute on the data without revealing any information about the data that's actually being computed on. We haven't talked about various privacy-enhancing technologies such as group signatures or ring signatures, and so on and so on and so on. So you can see that there's cryptography involves a lot more than what would be the basic encryption and decryption that you would get if you were just watching a Second World War movie and just considering the encryption, the Enigma machine. So I hope what we've done here is give you a quick introduction so you can get started on reading the CyBOK. And I hope you find reading the CyBOK interesting and you can go on further and study more about what cryptography can give you as a cybersecurity professional. Thank you very much for listening and have a good day.